Okay, now I will start. So my name is Victoria, and today we are going to hear an amazing talk by Lucia. Um, and before we hear Lucia's talk, I will do about a 10-minute introduction on the Design Justice Network, especially for those who are either new to the network or want to learn a little bit about the network. And so all of the slides have both English and Spanish for the welcome session part. And also, if you would like to follow along on the slides, you can click that link there or copy that link there. And Renee Joy, my coworker, will also be putting that into the chat for you. And I want to say a big thank you to Karen, who is doing our interpretation. And so to start, a little bit about me. Today I am, just to visually describe myself, I have brownish, blondish, brown blonde colored hair. I'm wearing green glasses. I'm wearing a keffiyeh, a white keffiyeh, in solidarity with Palestine and decolonial struggles everywhere, and a green sweater and a white t-shirt underneath. As I mentioned, I'm wearing the keffiyeh in solidarity with Palestine and decolonial struggles everywhere. And as Design Justice Principle number 1 states, we use design to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation are exploitative and oppressive systems that must be dismantled. And we therefore call on our communities to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people right now. And if you haven't seen already, Renee Joy will paste into the chat our solidarity with Palestine statement that the Design Justice Network has. And now to introduce myself, my name is Victoria. I use she and her pronouns, ella and español. I am a contractor for the Design Justice Network, a member of the Toronto Design Justice Node, and I also work part-time as a freelance digital graphic and web designer. And I am currently calling here on the territories of the Muisca in Bogota, Colombia. So today, before we meet Lucia, I'll do a brief introduction about the Design Justice Network. In the chat, you can follow along with the slides, and I will make a note that in the slides, they're yours to keep and to use later. There are links to various tools and resources and books that we mention, or that I will mention throughout the presentation. This is our main website, designjustice.org, where we have a lot of these resources that you'll be able to see. And I highlight 2 key ones to start off. A book, which is called Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need. This book is also currently being translated into Spanish, so the introductory chapter is in Spanish so far. And then our introduction to the Design Justice Network resource. That's in English, but I will note that on our website, we have a translation tool that will help translate some of the work that we have into other languages. So what is design justice? Design justice is a framework for analysis of how design of images, interfaces, objects, the built environment, socio-technical systems, how they influence the distribution of benefits and burdens between various groups of people. And I will explain more about this in 1 second. But just before I jump into the explanation, it's really important and part of the network, part of the work that we do within Design Justice Network is to recognize and acknowledge that a lot of the ideas that the network has come up with have come from a lot of amazing organizers, movement makers, movement builders before the network existed. And the slide that you see in front of you, I forget if I mentioned that I did translate the slides to both English and Spanish. Some of these that you see on the screen are English names that could not be translated. But you can click some of the links to find out some more of the philosophies, the different people and organizations that inspired design justice and the network and the principles. And so what you see on screen here is a black circle with 3 pink dots and then some green dots on the outside of that black circle. On the inside, you see the words design process. And what this represents, this image represents, is a typical design process whereby the people who are already with the most power are the ones who are part of the process within that circle, the pink dots, and those who are on the periphery are outside of that process, those green dots. That's a typical design process. When we're talking about design justice, when we are trying to put a focus on that, what we're talking about fundamentally is the distribution of benefits and harms of the people involved in that process. So it's about distributive justice or procedural justice. And so we ask the questions, who was involved in that process, who was harmed in that process, and who benefited in that process. And now I will give an example of just that. As I mentioned, or no, I didn't mention, but I will mention now. In a typical design process, the benefits of set design process tend to go to those with more power, and less benefits tend to go to those with the least amount of power. And so if I gave an example of an iPhone or a Samsung computer, or any of the appliances even that you use in your household. When we think about the process of making that iPhone or making those different products, the people who are the ones sort of at the lower end of that process, building, for example, with the iPhone, mining for the batteries that go into your iPhone, they are receiving very little benefits from the process of creating that iPhone, whereas those with more power, the CEO of Apple, for example, get a lot of benefits. More of those benefits, the money that comes in, including the designers, the UX and UI designers who design some of the programs. So there's a process that we're talking about that's a procedural process, but is not a just process. And in this same way, more of the harms tend to go to those with the least amount of power, and less of the harms tend to go to those with more power. So less harms go to that CEO, and more harms go to those who are working in the factories to build the actual iPhone itself, which is where the idea of design justice came about. So now on the screen, you see the black circle with the green dots on the center, and it still says design process, and the pink dots are inside of that circle. And what this shows is a design justice process. It expands the process so that the knowledge and experience of the community who are most effective are actually at the center of that design process. So those green dots there are in the center, and the pink dots are still part of the process, but on the periphery. And that's what we talk about when we talk about a design justice process. The people with the most lived experience, the people who are most affected by any design decisions are centered in that process. And so the design justice and the Design Justice Network is a growing community of practice that focuses on that equitable distribution of the benefits and the burdens of design, focuses on the meaningful participation in design decisions, and the recognition of community-based, indigenous, and diasporic design traditions, knowledge, and practices. What you see on screen now is a photo of a lot of really cool people. People like who are designers, who are artists, who are technologists or community organizers. And this is a photo from 2015 at the Allied Media Conference, which used to take place every year in Detroit, Michigan, which is in the United States. And the image is of a workshop that these folks took a part in called Generating Shared Principles for Design Justice. And the goal of this workshop was to move beyond the frames of design for good or design for social impact, and to actually challenge designers to think about how their good intentions are not necessarily enough to ensure that a design process or practice becomes tools for liberation, becomes a process of justice. And also the workshop was set up to develop principles that could help practitioners, designers from many different backgrounds, develop those principles to help avoid the reproduction of existing inequalities. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of overlapping communities of practice who do this type of work. And the folks that came, or the people that came to this session, were community organizers from lots of different backgrounds. In terms of the network, after that first year of drafting a set of principles, over the next 3 years, those principles were pulled apart, were edited, were revised to be the 10 design justice principles that we have available today that people can sign on or use in their own work, and also always freely modify or add more to. For example, if something is missing or there's an overarching thing that needs to be added. But in 2016, the 2 images you see are of people editing those principles and then saying thank you and goodbye to each other. And then the 2018 photo that you see is the year when the principles, the 10 design justice principles, were officially launched into the world and where people could read them and sign on. And the next slide has the 10 design justice principles here. They're in English. The next slide afterwards is the principles in Spanish. I'll show the English version for now, and I'll read out a couple of them. Number 10, that's my favorite one, so I'll read number 10. Before seeking new design solutions, we look for what is already working at the community level. We honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. Number 6, we believe that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience. We all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to the design process. And number 3, we prioritize design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer. I'm just going to leave up the Spanish version there for a second. Both of these, I will paste them into the chat. You can read them online on our website, and one of our volunteer opportunities that we have available to folks is to actually translate the principles or other parts of the work of the network, if that's of any interest at all. But translating the principles has been a really great way to both make them more accessible to people and allow more people to be able to read and access them, of course. This is the only slide that I forgot to change into Spanish, so I will do that before we share it out into the world after the presentation. But what you see on screen is the Design Justice Network DJN structure, how we work, and I'll explain that really briefly. So we looked at the 10 principles, and on the right-hand side, you can see a circle, and on the outer white rim of that circle, you see the word signatories, and those are people who have signed on to the design justice principles and use them in their own work. There are some other folks as part of the network who sign on to become members, and either members are folks who have paid a small fee to join the network, or are folks who are volunteering in some capacity. And I realized I forgot to mention who our members are or the process of becoming a member, but I'll read that out now. Becoming a member has been and is evolving. It involves a pay what you can fee. The minimum is 50 cents. But for us, it's really important that the network, it's possible for everybody to join and become a member if they wish. By having paid membership support, what it has done is help ensure that members are in community with each other, in alignment with the design justice principles, and in a space of care and safety. And for the time that it's been in existence, it has helped grow the capacity of the network immensely. But the goal is not to accumulate lots of paid members. It's more to find ways to encourage the facilitation of those members and directly support the work that members are doing and continue to manage safety. Renee Joy pasted into the chat for us some more information if you're interested to learn more about membership. And lastly, on screen, the inner circles, you see steering committee, working groups, and local nodes. So when people do join as a member, actually our working groups and local nodes are open to everybody, but to facilitate the working groups and local nodes, you must be a member, or you can join the steering committee who make decisions on behalf of the network. This is a slide that talks a little bit about a bunch of the different ways that people can get involved in the network, some of which I've mentioned already: signing on to the principles, joining the newsletter, joining as a member, attending an event, joining or starting a local node or working group, and of course, following us on various social medias. And you can find us very easily through the website. Here are some of those key resources I talked about a little bit at the beginning: the Design Justice book. There's also Design Justice zines, fanzines. They're freely available on the website. And then we've got some activities, just different activities that you can use in your own work or in your own life to activate or understand and use the principles in different parts of your work. And finally, there's different ways that people can become involved as volunteers in the network. I mentioned doing translation, supporting some of our communications work with different social medias or the website. There's writing opportunities, whether you join an event like the event we're at right now, or helping with note-taking at said event or social contacts, supporting with membership onboarding, benefits of members, and any other ideas are always very, very welcome. And very lastly, just the links, which have already been in the chat, I believe, but links in case you need later to become a signatory or to read more about the network or to join and become a member. And that, for me, concludes my part. And I'm going to pass us over to Lucia in 1 second. But I'm going to remind folks who have just joined, I'll also paste it in the chat, but that we have dual languages going on right now. So if you've just joined us and you are Spanish speaking, hay una habitación de interpretación para personas que quieren escuchar en español. Necesita clic el botón interpretación y select español, Spanish. And now I will introduce us to our guest of honor, Lucia. And I will read a little bit about her, but she is going to tell us everything about herself and the amazing work that she does. Lucia is a graphic and industrial designer. She's applied this knowledge in educational, social, and cultural programs for 10 years, working with youth, children, and adults in Ecuador, Mexico, and Chicago. Her research interest is centered on social and participatory design and intercultural education. She's passionate about co-designing in conjunction with communities, multicultural experiences, with an emphasis on visual and ethnographic research. Currently, she works at and facilitates participatory design processes with the students from the School of Design at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And I will introduce her. Here is Lucia.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. First of all, I'd like to welcome all those people who have joined us for this very interesting conversation that we're about to have. And I would also like to thank Victoria for this proposal in such way that this is in Spanish, a conversation in Spanish, because Spanish is my native language. And so it is very important for me to speak in my mother language so I can actually tell you better what I feel and how I felt about this process. So thank you very much for the Design Justice Network in order to share these experiences that I've had. And I've been very excited to share with you this, what I've lived. And I'd like to share with you something that I'm very passionate about, which is how to develop a participatory approach whenever we talk about design. So just as Victoria was saying, I am an Ecuadorian woman. I'm a mother. I'm a graphic designer and also industrial designer. And I have more than 10 years working in these areas. And I can say that at some point in this, let's say in this professional pathway, I discovered that I needed to have this participatory approach in everything that I was doing in order to connect with my audience, with the people that was surrounding me, because I'm part of a community. So it was very important for me to connect with them. And I'd like to say that the experience that I've had so far and the experience that I'm about to share with you, let's say in this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at the moment, is the result of a work of more than 10 years. This is the result of an experience that started out in Mexico with the Mayan community Chatil back in 2015 when I had the chance to get to work with these people, with this community. And this is a community that is at Quintana Roo in Mexico. And based on that, I've developed this approach I've conducted these participatory workshops with different communities in Ecuador, in the Amazonian part of the Ecuador, and now here in Chicago, where I'm working with a group of young people at the university. So in order to describe this presentation, I'm going to actually tell you about the experience that I've had this Chatil community, which is going to help me out to explain you better some of the concepts that are behind this research and also some of the methods that we've used. And I also want to share with you some of the experiences, some of the stories, and some of the, let's say, moments that I've shared with them. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Give me just 1 second. Can you please confirm if you can see my screen? Excellent. Thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge where I'm living. I'd like to acknowledge a place where I'm talking you from. I'm here in Chicago and I've been living here for 2.5 years. And I am living in this wonderful place, which is a community garden. And this is, let's say, this is the place where I develop most of my community activities. So let's say that surrounding this place, I'd like to say that in Chicago and Waters Garden are located on the unceded traditional lands of the Council of Three Fires. We have the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and many other tribes such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, which is the area where I'm living now. And I think it is important to be aware of such conditions so I can better appreciate where I'm living, the land that I'm living in, and how I connect with this space. And this region has been for a long time a territory for many different indigenous communities to meet up. And today it is one of it is one of the biggest urban communities that we have in the USA. So that's why I wanted to acknowledge the land where I live at the moment. And just to give you a general idea on what the presentation is going to be like, I'd like to tell you that first of all, I'll start off with a brief introduction and some of the personal motivations that have driven me to develop this work. And also I'm going to be talking about the conceptual guides and the methods that I've used for this participatory approach that I use at this Chatil community in Mexico. And I also would like to talk about the community participatory processes that we conducted there. And finally, I'll tell you a bit about the results of that we got to after working with this community. And based on that, I'll tell you some of the conclusions that I drafted out of this work. So I'd like to start to kick my talk off by telling you some of the inspirations that I've had before this work. If it were possible to have a framework for everything that I'm doing now, I would say that this is something that is related to the cultural realization, and it is connected to the culture and design as well. And some of the elements that are very important for me have to do with that culture, the popular culture, the local culture, and the culture that we have in every single city, or that we have in every single place where we cohabitate. So the first kind of references that I'd like to share with you is this book that is called Ojo al Aviso, which is pretty much an overview on the graphic design and communication. This book was published in 2008, and it puts together a visual research about the advertisements that were hand-drafted and that were in Ecuador. And the images that you see here are just a couple of images of what that visual record holds. And I'd like to say that in this book, I found another way in order to understand the popular revolution, and also a way for me to understand the artists that are producing this kind of art and to understand their meaning. This was conducted in a specific moment when in Quito, Ecuador, they were putting in practice many mandates in order to create a new visual perspective of the city, and there were many ideas in order to avoid visual contamination. But with this book, it was possible to reflect upon how these elements also talk about our culture. And let's say it is a very important piece for us to understand who we are culturally speaking. And these kind of mandates are, let's say, practices or policies that continue to be deployed. For example, in Mexico, in the delegation Álvaro Obregón, I knew of some initiatives that happened in that city, and we had, let's say that this city was objected with this cultural representation as well. So that is on the one hand, some of the reference that I wanted to share with you. And now talking about my personal standpoint regarding this cultural revitalization, I'd like to tell you something about my own story and in terms of my standpoint. So whenever I talk about this, I'd like to share with you, I'd like to tell you that I'm a Ecuadorian woman, mother, and I am a mixed woman. And my race is mixed. So this is the result of the colonization over the indigenous communities that has been, and this is a culture that has been denied, especially in the urban territory. And in my personal environment, I see many elements that are coming from the indigenous communities. For example, the language I speak takes many of these indigenous words, and I hold on many cultural practices that are coming from the indigenous knowledge or this indigenous wisdom. For example, the way that I cook or the way that I treat food. However, with education and together with many other systems, I acknowledge the lack of resources for me to create an indigenous identity. And so I feel apart from this indigenous community, from this indigenous identity. So as a mixed race, I would say that there are many things that were missing. And here I'm going back to Diana Albarrantes from 2002. She was an artist that pondering this question. Is it possible as a mixed person to recover our indigenous identity without reproducing the dominance or the privileges from colonialism? And this is also a call for us to remember or to recall. So that's why I wanted to actually highlight this standpoint, because I think that along the way, along the pathway that I've built for myself, if it is true that I've shared with many indigenous communities and I've shared some, let's say, knowledges that are coming from the design industry, I think that it's on them and they have allowed me to actually to learn from them, and I've learned a lot. And in such way, I think that I have rebuilt or reconstructed, or I have put together those pieces in order to create this cultural identity, which is something that I wanted to share with you, because unfortunately, I haven't been able to build my identity based on the educational system that I had at hand when I was first accessing my education. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on to telling you or to sharing with you some of these methodological background that I use. This is pretty much a work of cultural revitalization that is based upon these concepts. So to do so, I'd like to start by sharing with you what was the process like, and let's say, how did I access this ancestral knowledge? So at this point, I'd like to bring over what Pascual Morocho said. He is an indigenous activist. He is from the Curugua indigenous community in Ecuador, and he says that this ancestral knowledge are an expression of the worldview that are showing us in a very inclusive way how to work in our environment. This is also a call for us to think about these ancestral type of knowledge and these worldviews, how they are not only, let's say, the equity or the most important part of a community, but it is true for the entire humanity. This is something that we see nowadays, especially in terms of how to recover these worldviews, these indigenous worldviews, and how these indigenous worldviews could help us out to actually to re-encounter the pathway that we need to have as a society. And in that sense, I'd like to say that part of understanding this ancestral knowledge or this ancestral wisdom had also to know with understanding what are the key factors that drive change and that drive change in the way that we understand knowledge. And in that sense, I'd like to say that there are some drivers that are motivating this social change in terms of this Western homogenization and how this have taken hundreds of years. And that has to do with the social structures that we have and how we work in the different developments that we have as nowadays. And this is something that we see, for example, in the formal education or formal training, and we can see how the formal training that is happening within the indigenous communities is not including the community itself, or is not using their own language, or is not revitalizing their mother languages. So in that sense, I'm talking about education and the role of education, because that's the aspect that I think is going to impact the most the proposal that I work with. For example, with the Chatil community, as you will see later on, we work with a specific proposal with young people in order to actually impact high school students. And so we could understand better the dynamics within high schools or within these schools in their community. So with this, I'd like to say that what's happening nowadays in schools is not something that is happening exclusively in Mexico, but it's also happening in Ecuador. And in Ecuador, I had the chance of visiting the Sarayaco community at the beginning of this research process, and I got the chance to talk to many different community leaders, and I could actually confirm the idea or the need or the necessity as to create these materials that were community-based or that were community-led. So now I'd like to present you with some of the approaches that I use in order to revitalize this ancestral wisdom. So first of all, we started out by using the initiatives that are being, let's say, deployed at the communities. For example, the intercultural programs that are there both in Mexico and Ecuador. And it is also important to acknowledge that this revitalization must happen within the comprehension or within the understanding that they have, which is a spiral and circular, which is completely different from the one that we have in the city. And it is also important to understand the participatory processes as well. Within this, it is important to mention something that I'm very passionate about, which is the community education, the community-based education. For Martinez Luna, who's an anthropologist from Oaxaca, he mentions this community education as an educational process that is linked to the community life. So they're designing their education to be able to work with their specific attitude towards life. And in that sense, I think it is important to mention this, because this is linked to the input that we have by the Ecuadorian anthropologist Guerrero, where he talks about the different inputs and the insurgent knowledges. And this is going to be combined with the indigenous and the Black communities' knowledge or wisdom. And he also talks about how it is possible to expand the decolonized spaces in order to create and integrate knowledges coming from different realities, different times, and different feelings as well. In that sense, I think we should open up to receive what we have or what the world is offering us, regardless of where it's coming from. So it is important to have those parameters in line. And there is another aspect that I think it is important too, which is the heart, the feeling of your heart, which is pretty much telling us what are the 4 dimensions that we need to go back to: the affective dimension, the sacred dimension, the sacred spiritual dimension, the feminine dimension, and the revitalization of our knowledge, of our wisdom. And in that sense, what I wanted to say about these dimensions, I would like to say that these were the starting points that allowed us to start working with these communities, but this also helped us out to work with these let's say, with the way that we perceived some changes, or those, let's say, change drivers that I was telling you about before. And now to delve into the methodological aspect of this presentation, let's say that another approach that was very important has to do with the popular education that was proposed by the Brazilian author Paulo Freire. For Paulo Freire, community and the facilitators are in a constant conversation, and they need to understand their community in order to get to know how to work with them. So as I'm going to tell you, this is one of the most important aspects of the first stage of the process that I undertook with these indigenous communities. So first of all, we are going to start by assessing what are the specific needs of the community. In such sense, the concept proposed by Freire, whenever we talk about history, culture, And we need to understand what is the day-to-day life of these communities. And this is going to help us out to understand what are the natural and economic resources and how we are going to create a conversation with the community in order to identify a common good. And with that common interest or common good, we are going to develop the different workshops, or we're going to initiate the different educational strategies. So this is making sure that people themselves are empowered of the processes they want to be part of. So besides talking about relevant issues for them, we know how these processes are going to directly impact them. So within this design, maybe you can ask me how all of this is, let's say, connected with design. If we're talking about this ancestral wisdom, how is it connected to design? And this was also a question that I pondered myself at the beginning of this research, or at the start of this research, because most of the times whenever we talk about revitalization of culture or this ancestral wisdom, most of the times from the academy is understood from different perspectives, from the ethnography, anthropology, and some other, let's say, fields of knowledge. But whenever we talk about this participatory approach, I managed to find, let's say, a connection for these two aspects in such a way that I could connect to the communities by understanding and respecting their times and their, let's say, their world vision or worldview. So in that way, I can mention how this participatory design talks about this equitative dialogue or conversations. And here we are going to empower all the participants. It is very interesting to see how philosophy and how the philosophy of this participatory design goes in line with the popular education by Paulo Freire. So that is very, very interesting. That's something that I'm very passionate about. And now we also have this aspect of collective creativity. And here we need to think about how we need to have a different attitude whenever we talk about design. But if we actually think about the way that we work on culture and the way that we work on this collective creativity, where we include people from, or where we engage different people from a community. So here we are going to have this collective creativity, and this is the standpoint that is going to respect different people's opinions that are involved or engaged within the design practice. The third aspect talks about the co-design. Co-design has to do with the different stages that we can follow in order to undertake these processes. If we're working with a group of people that have not, or that doesn't have a specific training on design. So I think that the first thing that we need to have in mind is co-inspiration, co-ideation, and co-implementation. So here we are doing everything together. We're sharing our experiences and we're working together. For example, we are finding a common inspiration. So that's why we have a co-inspiration, and we are jointly thinking about different ideas. So that's why we talk about the co-ideation, in order to take all these ideas towards the implementation or to the community. So that's why the process that I'm about to tell you is based upon these concepts. And then I'd like to mention the autonomous design, where all the participants within this process are, or they interpret their own reality, and they are interpreters of what they do and what they know as well. And over here, just to community, and to do so, I'd like to talk about the participatory approach, where I like to say that the participants in this design project were students of the Anselmo School in Felipe Carrillo Cortes in Quintana Roo, Mexico. And there were also some of the Mayan leaders that are leaders in their church or in their community, and also some women, and the facilitators were Brendan They Trust and myself, Lucía Garcés, and also a facilitator for this project. In this Mayan community in Chatil, it was selected given the structure that they have with the specific leaders in their community. And I am very pleased to get to share with you some of the things that Mr. Sehime shared with me, and the words and the lessons that he taught me while I was there. And he was the leader for me in order to establish these trust bonds with this community. And Don Juan, or Mr. Juan, offers Mayan services for his community because he is a traditional healer in his community. From the very beginning, he raised a concern he had in regards of the lack of participation of young people in their traditional ways, given the different religions, and also given the migration of the members of his community. For Don Juan, or Mr. Juan, one of consequences of the migration of this urban migration is that there is a generational breakup in the way that wisdom or this traditional knowledge is going to be passed on to younger generations. So we found that there was a common interest for us to engage young people, and so they understand better their culture by providing it with a proper voice, with their own voice, and so they can have an autonomy in order to connect with this world in such an interconnected world that we're living nowadays. So here we conducted many different interviews with Don Juan at his place, and we conducted these interviews every so often. Here we can also see some of these Mayan houses, Mayan traditional houses in these communities, and we can see some of the environment there as well. Within this part, I'd like to talk about this participatory action and design research. So as I told you, the first thing that we did was the first connection point was the initiative, or let's say the concern that Don Juan had at the moment. And so that's why we were invited to his community. And also we got to work with some institutions that have worked with us before, such as the case of the Intercultural University at Quintana Roo, and also the Autonomous University in Mexico as well. And so we partnered with these organizations. In that first stage, we identified who or which could be the participants for this design, in this case, high school students, for us to get to work with this participatory approach. And we managed to have a specific work with women from this community in these community meetings that we would hold every so often. And likewise, we managed to identify the opportunity of conducting some interviews that would be more in depth with those elderly people in the community, so we could actually get to know them, or what would be the meaning of those things that they would share with us. And after that, there was an implementation. And let's say I'll share with you how these three groups, students, women, and the elderly, work together to put up together a material that was going to be used with kids, because here we thought about kids as the receivers or the end users of this, let's say, intergenerational product, or this intergenerational design. So within the process, the design process, we have the participatory process that actually was made up of 7 different sessions where we met up at schools, and we had the support of the local school, of course, in order to do so. And here we had the presence, or we had participants ranging between the 7 and 14 years, and they would help us out with the design, and they would select what topic they wanted to work on. So what they wanted to work on was recipes and traditional food and the medicine herbs that they would have in their community. So that was the topic that we used in order to work with the design process that we started out with. And based on this, let's say, triggering topic, we started to work in this co-inspiration, where we use many different things. For example, the action research, graphic design, ethnography, and we use all of these different concepts, such as the ethnography one, in order to create, together with them, a specific activity or some specific research dynamics that they would use within their own culture. And at the same time, we would draft some products out of this conversation or this dissertation. After that, we managed to work together with youngsters, adults, and the elderly in the community as to decide which would be the best way to transfer this knowledge. In this case, it was the community that, based on all of the exercises that were conducted and based on these co-inspiration moments, then they were the ones that said that they were the ones who decided how they would communicate all this knowledge, not only to this community, but also other communities. So they were the ones who actually decided on the means they would use. And in the last stage, the co-implementation, you'll see how this tool or these tools were implemented within the community. And this is, let's say, this is an interactive material that was implemented in many situations. So with these images that I'd like to share with you, we can see mainly these three key moments within the methodology that we undertook with this community. So the first one has to do with the triggering topic, and it talks about the traditional recipes and the use of local herbs for medicine uses. So all of the exercises that we conducted here were aimed to understand their lifestyle within their community, the social lifestyle, the celebrations, and how they understood life. After this, after having this triggering topic, we would create these visual dialogues through different graphic expressions. So here we would have the community maps, we would have these map ideas, or that would take us to the development or to the creation of some games, and how we would use this knowledge, let's say all this structure, in order to be deployed with games, and how we would, let's say, gamify everything that we have learned. And the last stage has to do with the co-implementation of the different tools that we have created with the rest of the community. This last stage is a very enriching moment because as facilitators, we can see how our tools actually come to life and how they're going to share all of these elements with their community. And this is going to create some engagement within their community. So that was very interesting to see how at the moment that we started to share this tool that we have created and how it was implemented with different schools and different families, many different families actually took us over to their places, to their homes, to show us how they have implemented this. So it was very important to actually to have this exchange at that moment. And now I'd like to go over some of the results that we reached with this investigation, with this community game in this participatory project, because as I said, we actually wanted to revitalize all of this cultural wisdom. So what I would like to highlight is that by having this common language between the different participants of such initiatives, we could see how different members of the community and designers managed to create a network in order to strengthen those bonds in the community. And with this, we would have intergenerational conversations that would be alternative as to overcome communication barriers. And we would have some community maps. We would have some other ideas, lotteries, for example, and some other games that were useful as a narrative in order to promote social interaction, just such as, and it is a co-creation of the community by using different images in order to learn from them, and we could learn how to learn and how to work with these cultures. So this is the result of a social interaction that was drafted as part of a conversation. So what I want to present you with now are some of the tools that we developed, which is these community games, board games that would deal with, let's say, the local plants. And here we created, let's say, different materials and that were used, let's say, and these materials were based on the knowledge that they have as a community. But this would be, let's say, and this would be something that they have, and they have the lottery. This is a very traditional board game in Mexico. So that's why we use both these, let's say, these structures, because this was the recommendation of one of the members of the community, as to reproduce the knowledge that we have learned from them. And this board game is made up of 28 different images, which correspond to 28 different plants that are the most important in the community, and that were, let's say, cross-reference with the different members of the community, the different groups in the community. And so here we can get to know what are the different uses that these plants may have for their well-being and for their nutritional means as well. So here we have 4 different categories of uses, and it was set through the collaboration that we would have with the elderly and the women in the community. So this tool was initially drafted, and let's say, I'd like to describe it very quickly as, let's say that each of the participants or the people that would play this game would start by starting out an invitation, talking with the elder people in their family, so they can actually get to share what are the different uses of these plants and how they can use it for ceremonies or for healing purposes. After that, in the back of these cards, they are part of the game. So each of the players are going to receive these cards, and they are 4 by 4, and then they will use these cards to play the game as if it were a bingo. This would be an image bingo. But the difference here is that we're playing with the images, but we're also playing with the knowledge that is behind all these images and how important it is for this Mayan community. And it was also important for us to include the Mayan language, and they were the ones who requested us to use the Mayan language, because once we have created the material, they requested us to actually translate it into Mayan for them to actually revitalize their own language. So that was something very important as well. So finally, and to wrap up this presentation and this description of this experience, this material, I like to say that this material was created for them and by them, and it is a complement for based on the community approach developed by Freire, because here we're talking about a reflection that they have on their environment or the background and how they can actually impact it by impacting it and by having different conversations around it. So here we are going to work in this participatory design and this popular education that promotes the awareness of different levels of the community and how we can connect to each other. As a result, this participatory design respects the worldview that each community may have, and it also contributes to having a research system that is based on the learnings that each community may have, where the designers are co-researchers together with the members of the community, and the participants are the ones that are going to be leading the research and are going to be the interpreters of the reality. So with that, I like to wrap up my presentation, and thank you once again for this opportunity. And I'd like to finalize with this image where we have Don Juan with the group of students that we got to work with in this Chapal community in Mexico. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Muchísimas gracias. I will continue speaking in English. And as a reminder, for folks that are listening in Spanish, make sure you are on the Spanish channel. For folks listening in English, make sure you are on the English channel. And now we have time for questions and answers. Any questions you have, especially for Lucia, about her work and about the presentation. And so I will first open it for any audio questions. If you would like to verbally say, ask a question, if you could use the reaction or the raise hand option so that I know it's you, and then just note that before you say your question, just say whether you'll say it in English or in Spanish so that Karen knows which channel to be on for the translation. Would anyone like to ask a question verbally or share any ideas or feedback that you have as well? I see a question in the chat. Okay, I'm going to read this. I'm going to read the question in the chat. It's in English. And then I see someone with their hand up called Aaron. So Aaron, you can go second. Okay, the question in the chat is, thank you, Lucia. I apologize if I missed this detail, but I am curious who is now stewarding the design outcome. Is it owned by anyone? Is the ownership shared? Okay, go ahead.
It is a very interesting question. Is to get to know who, let's say, who or how, or let's say who owns the rights of this process, or who's continuing with the stewardship of this project. And in that regard, I'd like to mention two aspects. The first one is that when we first started with the implementation of this tool, we created different games. We actually printed out different sets. And anytime that we would have the implementation of these board games, let's say that that family would own their game. So with that, let's say we were not interested in, let's say, recording how we would actually own this knowledge. Let's say that our process was, let's say, addressed to creating the tool and actually to getting to share it with the community. But the knowledge that they shared continues to be their own because they were the ones who created these games based on their knowledge. So it is their own knowledge. And after having this process completed, the local school, let's say, was responsible for this material, and also the Mayan church. And each of the families, as I said before, they own, let's say, the different sets that we printed out. That on the one hand. And I don't know if I answered your question with my explanation. Please let me know.
In the chat, I see yes. Thank you. That definitely answers it. The next question will be in Spanish, so I will let Aaron go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Lucia. I'm Aaron, and I'm in Puebla, Mexico. And I wanted to ask you, how did you find this opportunity to get to work together with this community? Because it is quite impressive. Thank you very much for your question, because this takes me back to tell you a bit more on what was the, let's say, the origin of this project. So what I can tell you is that the idea of getting to work with this kind of contents with indigenous communities started out in Ecuador, where, let's say that around 2010, when I was working with an organization that worked with the Sariaco community in Ecuador. So from that moment on, I identified this need and how we should create some sort of contents, or let's say some kind of products that were raised from the community. So let's say this personal interest was taken to my master's degree when I was conducting my master's degree in Mexico at the Autonomous University. So in that moment, I came up with the idea of how to put together design and the revitalization of this cultural wisdom. And in this master's degree, let's say that this was very helpful for me to, and they were to continue with this, and they were very receptive, and they welcome my initiative up to the moment that I managed to complete this whole research. Another aspect that is very important is to actually mention is the connection or the partnership that we have with the intercultural Mexican University, which was very useful for us to identify which could be the specific places where I could actually be working with this kind of project. And so I got to work with different professors, for example, Lucía Galán and other professors, and they were key for the development of this research project because they actually showed me the way in order to complete this project. That's very impressive. Thank you very much, Lucia.
Okay, and the next question is in English. I will read it out. It is from Celine. I am curious about the middle step described the graphic expression map of ideas. How do you translate conversations into a map of topics for participants to narrow down that isn't overwhelming for them, but also covers the depth of complexity?
Yes, thank you, Selene. I would like to ask, just to make sure if you want me to describe a little bit more about the conceptual maps or the conceptual maps or the story maps that I use in the net, or both.
So to talk about these kind of tools, it is very interesting because the first tool that we used is these community maps that we drafted. And let's say that was that happened at the very beginning in the first sessions that we undertook with them. And we started to use these community maps to to actually to work with the young people, the understanding of their position in their community. So based on this, where they would identify, let's say, where they live and what are their daily routines and what are, let's say, those most important places for their daily routines would help us out to understand the complexity in their daily life and how they would exchange on a daily basis with their community. So this gave us an idea on how we would work, and also this could help us out to understand what would be the connection of the different stories that are happening in the community. So based on this map, that is very important because this is, let's say, the first, let's say, approach that we have to this collaborative work. Then we had the triggering topic. So based on this and based on all of these community maps and these conceptual maps, we managed to understand which would be the specific topic that we would be dealing with as a group. And based on that, we started to work with the concept maps, which are more complex. It took us a bit longer to work with them. And let's say that at the beginning, they are a bit overwhelming, yes, and in how to understand them. But what we tried to do there was trying to understand what were those knowledges or what were those things that the elderly have, what would be that kind of wisdom that the elder generations want to pass on to the younger generations. So some of the examples that we received was, for example, that my grandpa knows how to put together a ceremony. My father knows how to mine, and I'm trying to learn how to do something else. So this helped us out to understand, and it was very interesting because we could see different hierarchies, but also different responsibilities within the process. And it was interesting to understand. And I think that there was another tool that was useful for us to understand how these knowledges are passed on to different members of the community. And Celine, please let me know if I answered to your question or if there's anything else that you'd like me to deepen in. So please let me know if it's clear or if you need any further clarification in this regard.
There is one clarification or additional part. I'm curious about the approach of drawing these concept maps from a blank piece of paper. What is your first design thought?
So whenever we talk about this, let's say that, let me see if I understand your question correctly. But I think that in this kind of, or with this kind of tools, let's say with these two different maps that we had, given that we're not looking for a specific design product in terms of, let's say, the design of the materials, but we wanted to understand how to put the contents together. So in that sense, for the approach that we had, let's say that I'd like to understand a bit better what you mean by this approach or the approach of drawing these concept maps. Could you please explain me a bit more what you mean by this? That'd be very useful. Thank you.
Hello, I will be speaking in English. Is that okay? I guess I'm asking in relation to my own projects, in which I have been having community conversations, and we've been having really deep, complex conversations. And I'm trying to figure out how to move us to sort of choosing a topic. And there's so many notes. And even I have like papers of just all the post-it notes, and it still feels very overwhelming. And I think about how can I distill the knowledge in a way that makes it easier and approachable. And whenever I think about that, it feels overwhelming.
Thank you very much for expanding on your question. So, for example, in this case, we worked, let's say that it wasn't us who worked on these maps, but it were the facilitators of the workshops. It was the participants. It was them who created these concept maps and these community maps. Let's say that I feel that, let's say that whenever we want this participatory approach, you could, let's say that could be a way in which you can lead this process, because when you assess or when you try to analyze all the knowledge, when you try to transfer all these notes, all these post-its, then you're already interpreting the knowledge. You're interpreting everything that you're receiving. And let's say that with this project that I have just presented you, it was their interpretation, not my interpretation. So it was all owned by them. So yes, it is true that we transferred some tools, we gave them some tools, but it was them. Let's say the interpretation was on them. So let's say regarding, and also they were the ones who actually highlighted the topic that they wanted to work on. And something that I think could be useful, and this is something that one of the professors of the Intercultural University told me, was a tool that is called Think for Myself, Not for the Rest, which is a very useful tool in order to get to work with youngsters, where each of the members of the group would be given the opportunity to decide which would be the topic that they'd like to work with and why is it important for them and not the rest, even if it is not important for the rest. And based on that, you can actually build up on some consensus. You can come to a general, let's say, agreement when listening to each of the voices in a group.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
If you have any other questions or you'd like me to expand on maybe a bit more, just let me know.
I just say thank you and give space to other people. Gracias.
I have an additional question. There is some sort of resources or websites where we can find information for this kind of, let's say, participatory approaches, let's say, tools. Sure, about the resources, I think there are plenty of materials out there that I could share with you. But something that I'm using in my own practice are resources that are coming from critical geography. So you can actually find groups of critical geography in Latin America or in the United States or in Europe, in Germany. And let's say that from this critical geography, you can actually get to work with these community maps, which is actually something that is very useful. This is something that you can actually exploit a lot from here. And you can actually get to understand, and you can actually manage to understand with the participants how they understand the space they live in, they cohabitate. So there are many groups in Latin America, for example, the Clasist, and there's a group that is the Oranco Tanco. And I can actually, if you want me to, I can share this information with you. If you actually drop your email, I can actually share that information with you. And there are some other tools that are coming from architecture. There is a website that is called Community Mapping, that is also going to give us a series of resources of people who have been working in this kind of processes from different areas. But something that is important that I'd like to mention now is that I don't think that in these community processes, let's say these traditional design tips are going to be applicable. Because with that, I'd like to say that whenever we use these design kits or these design tips, and whenever you use this kind of, let's say, very general kits, you are not actually accessing the true, let's say, the true soul of a community. So with that, let's say that that's why actually I prefer working with the participants, and they're going to teach you the way. They're going to be the ones that are going to teach you the way. They're going to tell you how to lead the process or how to move forward. Something that is important here with the Chatil youngsters is that at the beginning of the workshop, I remember that I tried to be, let's say, I tried not to plan as much and to have very little planification. So I wouldn't have, let's say, an agenda, but I wanted to be very flexible with them. And based on that, I managed to have a specific process, and that would allow me that each of the meetings would be, let's say, the driving meeting for the next one. And then I would take note of all of their comments, their inputs, and this allowed me to think what would be the next step. So let's say that it was a constructive and increasing, let's say, an growing process. And then I included elements that they requested, or elements that they were the ones that pinpointed. For example, the community game. That was something that was, let's say, that they were the ones who just suggested this. So that's why I listened to them. How can I send you my email? Maybe through the chat box? Is that okay with you, Victoria, if he sends his information through the chat?
Yes, you can send a private note if you don't want everyone to see it. Just find Lucia's name, and then you can share just there with her. And if for some reason that doesn't work, Erin, you can send us an email at Design Justice, our email, and I'll connect you. Yeah. Okay. Someone wrote in Spanish, so I'll read in Spanish, Karen.
español.
Yo también
It
quisiera
says, I would also
recursos, por
like to
favor.
receive some of these resources, please.
La persona se llama Estela.
Her name is Stella. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in Spanish. But yeah, I'd like to learn about these resources that Lucia is using, and especially, and with what you have just said, that is very useful too. Like being flexible when planning, because I was about to ask you that question. I was about to ask you what had been the process like, if it was strict or not, or if you have any kind of recommendations. But it is very useful knowing that it is important to be flexible, and that's very useful for my research as well. Thank you very much. Well, some of the resources is, let's say, the journal, your field journal. I think that's very useful. So we can all have, let's say, a better understanding, and we can actually take note of those things that are important. Even the discussions are important, the discussions that are happening within the group discussions, because here we have a participatory approach. So it is important to see how these discussions are happening, how they come to agreement. So that's why it's important to actually take note of all of those things, and to actually pay attention to all of those different moments within the process. I think that is very, let's say, telling of a whole dynamic. And it is also important to be flexible, because it is important to be flexible, but it's also important to have in mind what is the objective of your research. In my case, it was the revitalization of this cultural knowledge, and how it's going to work together with the community in order to get to know how we could involve and how we could engage different groups in the community, for example, including women and including the elderly. So having that, let's say, that north, and having this compass, it was, let's say, the way that I would, let's say, be flexible, not in terms of the objectives, but in terms of the different activities that were going to happen.
Two more questions. The first in English.
Those two additional questions. The first one is in English.
What are your strategies for staying consistently present and energized as a facilitator? It requires a lot of energy, and I find that some days are better than others for me.
Wow, that's a very good question. Because something that I see nowadays in my current practice as a facilitator in the design school here at Illinois, in Chicago, in Illinois, I find that as facilitators, we are, let's say, we are facilitators of agreements or this consensus. So one of the strategies that I found to be useful, or let's say that at the moment in the discussions that we have in design, something that is very useful is that we start to talk about care, and the care that we should have towards the participants. And I think that that's, let's say that that's a key to have in mind these parameters, or these, let's say, different ways of personal care, but also group care. And I think that by finding solution of arguments whenever they arise, it is also, or let's say, solution of disagreements, this is going to be useful for us to have this rhythm or these dynamics, because sometimes it is difficult to keep it up, but it is, but let's say that this is something that you're going to develop in as much as you get to know the group, and how we can actually find solutions to different obstacles that you may have on a daily basis within these discussions or these conversations that you have. And I think that's something that is also useful for the facilitators in this case, has to do with the response of the participants. So it is important to pay attention to their feedback, to their comments, to their what they have to say regarding to what's going on. And I think it is important to be attentive of what they have to say in their feedback.
The next, la próxima, is in español. It's in Spanish.
Next question in Spanish. Okay.
Hola, Lucía.
Hi,
Muchas
Lucia.
gracias por
Thank you very much
compartir.
for sharing.
Tengo curiosidad
I'm
si la
curious
comunidad que
about
participó
knowing if the
ha
community that
tenido la
participated in this
oportunidad
process has
de
had
presentar
the
el
chance
proceso
of
en alguna
presenting the
ocasión.
process has had the chance to present this process elsewhere. Well, the participants, let's say that here it is important to differentiate two different moments. The workshop participants, which were the high school students, they presented this material for their community in different situations or in different moments. So they led the implementation of these tools, for example, in the primary school and also in the community house that they had in their community. And this was, let's say, a very enriching moment and a very exciting moment for their own process, because altogether they, let's say, they actually could claim for their rights for their own creations. So they were the ones that owned the creation of this material. So let's say that they owned this process and they were the ones presenting this project. Let's say we as facilitators, we would be engaged, let's say just as bystanders, but they were the ones who owned the process. And in some other process that we have, for example, in Ecuador, it was very interesting to see that as a result of this, on a project in Ecuador, the final product was also a game. And in that case, they invited their community to have an open house in their community house, and each of the participants presented each of the different games that they have come up with, and we had about 100 kids. So this was, let's say, a very well organized activity that was all put together by this group. But if they have, and now if you're referring to a more kind of academic scenario, they haven't presented out these results as part of an academic scenario. But there are some documents, some papers that I've been working on where I have tried to translate all these experiences that you can actually find in the website at www.jugando.org, where you can see some of these comments and some of these experiences as well. And did I answer to your question, or is there anything else that you'd like me to clarify? Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you, Laura.
I forgot I have to say everything in English. My apologies. The last question I'll read again. Thank you for sharing. I have the curiosity if the community had the opportunity to present the process in any occasion. And that's what Lucia just answered. But just to say again aloud in English. There are two more questions I see in English. Thank you for your talk. And which community mapping site was being referred to? I think she's looking for the site now. in the meantime, while Lucia is looking, I'll read one of the notes in the chat that Renee Joy, another contractor of the network, has shared. Building on Lucia's insight around care, Design Justice Network's CarePod currently hosts care circles and practice spaces focused on care practices for building liberatory cultures together. And in the chat, there's a link to that. It's also written in the chat in Spanish.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. As to get to talk about this and to share my experiences and to share the meanings of this experience, which, let's say, as years go by, you find many new meanings as time goes by for the different processes that you have undertaken. And hopefully this is useful for you to actually reinterpret and to retranslate all of this to different moments, and we can actually get to share all this knowledge. So thank you very much for the opportunity.